Good afternoon. I'm Helen Rinsberg, president of Cincinnati Asian Art Society, CAS to our friends. Welcome to our second virtual lecture. This is our way of staying in touch with our members and friends during the pandemic. But of course, we hope to see you in person soon. Today, our speaker is Dr. Katherine Kasdorf, Associate Curator of Arts of Asia and the Islamic World at the Detroit Institute of Arts. She received her Ph.D. in South Asian art history from Columbia University in 2013. At the DIA, she collaborated with colleagues on the reinstallation of the Asian collection, opening new galleries in November 2018. Prior to joining the DIA in 2017, she held a Wieler-Mellon postdoctoral curatorial fellowship at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, where she curated the exhibition Ferocious Beauty, Wrathful Deities from Tibet and Nepal, and worked on new permanent collection galleries. She has published articles on architectural reuse in Hindu and Islamic context in South Asia, and on works of Tibetan art at the Walters Art Museum. Current projects include research related to the DIA's South Indian Yogini sculpture and publications on Hoysala period, that's 12th to 13th century, temples in India, Karnataka state. So I will turn it over to you, Katherine, and I'm so looking forward to this.
Thank you. Thank you for that warm welcome, Helen. And thanks to both Helen and Ainsley for inviting me to participate in the Cincinnati Asian Art Society's online lecture series this year. And I hope very much to visit your city and museums soon when we can all safely travel again. So I'm going to begin my talk today. Whoop, let me advance, there we go, with one of my favorite sculptures at the Detroit Institute of Arts. This Yogani goddess from southern India, carved sometime between the late 9th and mid-10th century. Here are two views of her in the gallery taken from different angles. With her curved backdrop rising some 46 inches in height, the seated figure is human-sized or even a little bit larger, and she has a commanding presence. Between her voluptuous body, terrifying expression, and various attributes, which I'll discuss more in a few moments, she embodies both alluring and threatening qualities. This uniting of seemingly contrasting characteristics is one way in which she might be considered a goddess of multiplicity, a theme I'll be trying to tease out as I discuss this goddess, related sculptures, and their changing contexts over the past 1,000+ years. In fact, she's just one of many such Yogini sculptures that once inhabited the same temple, another way she might be considered a goddess of multiplicity. Unfortunately, no trace remains of this temple, but as we'll see, other Yogini temples can provide a general idea of its architectural forms. Among the sculptures surviving from the South Indian Yogini temple, 11 Yoginis and one sculpture of the god Shiva, all approximately the same size and carved in the same style, are today dispersed across museum collections in North America, Europe, and India. When the temple was active, these images would not have been considered mere sculptures. To the temple's ritual community, they would have physically embodied the very presence of the deities that they depict. These sculpted images were the Yogini goddesses, and they were Shiva. Long after this temple had ceased activity in 1926, these sculptures were found together at a site in northern Tamil Nadu in southeastern India by the French archaeologist Gabriel Dupuy and his Indian associate, Thangavelu. Although the original temple was no longer standing, the sculptures were probably very close to where it had once stood. Dupuy and Thangavelu removed the sculptures from this site, then shipped most of them to the Paris-based art dealer C.T. Liu. I'll say more about this later. I'd like to note that my discussion of the South Indian Yoginis' history is indebted to the work of Padma Kaimal, whose book, Scattered Goddesses, Travels with the Yoginis, traces the lives of these sculptures from the 10th century to nearly the present day, when the book was published in 2012. Kaimal also discusses these sculptures together with the Yoginis and the Shiva, two smaller goddesses known as Matrikas on the left, In the center, a sculpture of a god called Shanmuga or Skanda, and two door guardians on the right. It's possible that they too were enshrined in the same temple as Kaimal posits, but I think that differences in their size and form make the relationship between these sculptures and the Yoginis just a little more complex. So today, I'll be focusing primarily on the Yoginis and the Shiva. After taking a closer look at the DIA's Yogini and her iconography, I'll think through a series of questions about the temple for which she and her companions were made. Then I'll discuss the 20th century history that led these Yoginis to the museums that now steward them. Lastly, I'll show some of the museum settings in which we find the Yoginis today, and I'll consider some possibilities for the future. But first, a few points of clarification are in order. It's probably clear to you that these Yoginis are quite different from the spandex-clad yoga enthusiast that the word Yogini might conjure in some people's minds today. What most Americans think of as yoga is just one part of a much larger, multi-branched and changing system of beliefs and practices historically considered yoga. These ideas were wonderfully explored through the Smithsonian exhibition, Yoga, the Art of Transformation, which some of you might have seen when it traveled to Cleveland in 2014. And the curator, Deborah Diamond, brought these 3 Yogini sculptures together for that show. Now, the Sanskrit word yoga is related to the verb to yoke, and many yoga traditions aim to bridge the gap between microcosm and macrocosm, between the individual and the universe. The Yoginis we see in the DIA sculpture and her companions are connected with an aspect of yoga aimed at harnessing divine power within the individual practitioner or devotee. This kind of yoga is closely tied to tantric practice, and indeed, Yoginis like these are considered to be tantric goddesses. Now, like yoga, the terms tantric and tantra have very different associations today, especially in the West, than they did in India during the 9th and 10th centuries when our Yogini sculptures were made. I'll elaborate on this as we go on, but a key point to note is that a core aim of tantric practice in the context of our Yoginis is the attainment of power, and especially supernatural powers. Some of the beliefs and practices involved in gaining such power go against the grain of mainstream convention, and they can be dangerous. Because of their power and potential danger, tantric teachings are closely guarded. Someone must be initiated into a particular tantric tradition before gaining the knowledge which that tradition imparts. And yoginis are said to both guard and impart these teachings. Now, I want to make one more point to ground our understanding of the Yogini's religious context before returning back to the DIA sculpture. Yoginis have a place in numerous South Asian religious systems, including various Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain tantric traditions, beginning around the 7th or 8th century. Later on, Yoginis have a place in certain Islamic traditions too. The DIA Yogini and her companions are associated with Hindu traditions, which conceptualize goddesses as embodiments of Shakti, a divine energy that is gendered feminine and is considered to be the driving force behind action in the universe. Today, we'll be focusing on yoginis from these tantric Hindu traditions. So let's take a closer look at the DIA Yogini and at those features that make her both alluring and threatening. She sits with crossed legs and bends her torso and head in almost an S shape. We can imagine her swaying from side to side, perhaps slowly or perhaps vigorously, her movement enhancing the energy that just explodes from her body. She fixes her face in a menacing expression, staring out with bulging eyes under an intensely furrowed brow, and opening her mouth to bare teeth and fangs. Her unbound hair radiates around her head with a wild energy. Historically, in South Asia, unbound hair in a female figure signals transgression, so this is one of her threatening features. But a beautiful diadem also adorns her head. This bejeweled headdress is one feature she shares in common with more peaceful goddesses. Now, the Cincinnati Art Museum, some of you might know, has a beautiful South Indian bronze goddess sculpture with all the conventions of a peaceful goddess. Her crown is a closer comparison to the crowns of other yoginis from our group, such as the one now at the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City. Across many South Asian traditions, adornment is considered to be auspicious, so this goddess is adorned with jewelry from head to toe. So is this celestial maiden from northern India, also at the Cincinnati Art Museum. Adornment of the body is important across South Asia. The South Indian yogini too wears jewelry. Other features the DIA yogini shares with peaceful goddesses include her necklaces, bracelets, and other items of jewelry, and her curvaceous fit body at the peak of fertility. These are all features of an idealized female beauty seen throughout the history of South Asian art. Not all of her jewelry is conventional, however. Where we would expect to see armlets and a sacred thread resting diagonally across the yogini's torso, live snakes wind their way around her body, rearing their hooded heads. Potentially venomous, they pose a threat to the viewer, though not to the goddess, and their slithering movements add to the yogini's dynamism and energy. Other attributes have clear associations with death. The cup she holds in her lower left hand is understood to be made from a human skull, and she sits above a headless corpse, which is carved into low relief on her pedestal. Such things are considered to be polluted and taboo in more mainstream Orthodox traditions, and the yogini's close association with them overturns normative expectations. Damage to the sculpture has cost the yogini her lower right arm, and we have no way of knowing what that hand might once have held or what gesture it may have made. Both upper arms are well preserved, however, and in those hands, she holds a shield and a club, martial objects that can be used both to harm and to protect, as Kaimal in her book Scattered Goddesses notes in her discussion of this yogini. Drawing attention to the twofold nature of these weapons, Kaimal also makes a larger point about the character of yoginis themselves. They embody both auspicious and inauspicious qualities, as we've seen, dismantling binaries at every turn. Yoginis, as their iconography suggests, are extremely powerful. As goddesses associated with tantric traditions, their power is in part connected to their overturning of orthodox norms and their embracing of what is commonly considered to be impure, objects like the corpse the DIA yogini sits upon, or the skull bowls that she and many of her companions hold. Yoginis guard tantric teachings from the uninitiated, restricting the powerful knowledge of these traditions to the initiated few. To individuals who hold this knowledge and who correctly perform the arduous practices it demands, yoginis may grant great powers, such as the ability to fly, the ability to become very large, very small, victory over one's enemies, and other magical abilities. But to individuals who do not follow their practices correctly, yoginis can be lethal. A yogini does not act alone, however. These goddesses always occur in groups. Most commonly, texts refer to groups of 64 yoginis, though they may occur in other numbers too. Extant Yogani temples enshrine dozens of goddesses along the inner walls of open-air structures. Yoginis are believed to fly, so their temples must be roofless. And I'll say more about Yogani temples later on. Among known Yogini sculptures, which come from different parts of India, no two are exactly alike. Some are more ferocious, appearing furious and holding objects like weapons, skulls, or even severed heads, while others are more benign. Some yoginis have idealized bodies suggestive of a woman in her sexual prime, while others appear more aged. Still others are withered and emaciated. Some yoginis appear human in form, while others have the heads of various animals. As the scholar Shaman Hatley has noted, certain religious texts even describe yoginis as shape-shifting beings. Their forms are inherently multiple. Between the weapons, skulls, jewelry, body types, animal forms, and facial expressions, there's a common vocabulary across the iconography of these goddesses, both within a particular set of yoginis and between different temples. Each individual goddess, however, has her own individualized features and attributes. Rarely does this individualized iconography repeat exactly. In at least some cases, yoginis were assigned individual names too. For instance, in the Yogani temple at Bharagat in central India, names are inscribed into the pedestals of each sculpture. as the scholar Vidya Deheja demonstrated in her foundational book on Yogani Temples. These names, however, are not consistently repeated at other temples, nor do they correspond exactly to lists of Yogani names appearing in religious texts, which themselves vary between different texts. As with Yogani's visual iconography, their names are individualized and multiple. No names are inscribed on the South Indian Yogini sculptures, but it's possible to imagine that visitors to their temple may have known each goddess by an individual name. This is just one of many questions we can ask about these yoginis in the context of the temple they once shared. I'd now like to think through some more questions about this temple. I'll consider when it was built and where, how many yoginis it enshrined, what it might have looked like, and who might have been involved in its construction and ritual community. I won't be resolving many of these questions, though, and indeed, none of them have straightforward answers, and some may never be possible to resolve definitively without going back in time. And that brings me to my first question. If we were to go back in time to the moment when these Yogini sculptures were made and their temple was built, when would that be? Sometimes we're able to date sculptures and temples based on inscriptions, documents carved in stone or engraved into copper plates that record the foundation of a temple or describe donations to provide for its ritual life. No such inscriptions are known to be associated with the South Indian Yoginis, however, so scholars have relied in large part on stylistic dating, comparing them to more securely dated sculptures. This has led many scholars to date the Yoginis to the 10th century, though some consider the late 9th century too. In her careful consideration of the Yoginis' dating, Padma Kaimal drew attention to these late 9th century comparisons, but she ultimately argued that the Yoginis' more pronounced projection into space surrounding them is more of a 10th century trend, and she dated them to circa 900 to 970. Although the DIA's Yogini has long been dated to the 10th century, the more I look at comparisons, the more I think we should consider the possibility, at least, of a slightly earlier dating. Stylistic comparisons are relevant to our next question too. Where are they from? While nobody has ever doubted these Yoginis' association with northern Tamil Nadu, their exact place of origin has long been a point of debate. Letters from Jouveau Dubreuil, the French archaeologist who collected the sculptures with Mr. Tungavelu, say they were found in Kanchipuram, a city also called Kanchi, a well-known city approximately 75 kilometers southwest of Chennai, today the capital of Tamil Nadu. Between the 3rd and 9th centuries, Kanchipuram was capital of the Pallava dynasty, then the main political power of northern Tamil Nadu. In the 9th and 10th centuries, multiple polities fought to claim control of the region and city, but eventually it became a regional capital of the Chola dynasty, whose homeland was further south. Kanchipuram is famous for its temples, but none quite correspond in style to the South Indian Yoginis. Vidya Deheja noticed this, and in her 1986 book on Yogani temples, she suggests that the South Indian Yoginis were instead from Kaveripakkam, a town some 25 kilometers west of Kanchi. Numerous sculptures and architectural fragments from Kaveripakkam are now housed at the Chennai Government Museum, and a few more remain in Kaveripakkam itself, on the premises of temples that now feature later architecture. The stylistic consistency between the town's sculpture and the Yoginis is indeed striking. More recently, Emma Stein has persuasively made the case for the Yoginis' Kaveripakkam origins through an analysis not only of artistic style, but also of stone type. In her forthcoming monograph on Kanchipuram and its temples, Stein shows that temples in Kanchi during the Pallava period were consistently built of sandstone, while those of the Chola period were built of granite, both locally available materials during the respective historical eras. By contrast, the Yoginis have been found to be carved from an igneous rock called Metagabro. The stone is nowhere to be found in Kanchi, but it is abundant in the Kaveripakkam materials. If the Yoginis and their companions came from Kaveripakkam, then we might reasonably ask why Jouveau Dubreuil said he had found them in Kanchi. It's quite possible that he only meant that the Yoginis had been found in the region of Kanchipuram rather than the city itself. with Chuvau du Broy's own home of Pondicherry, some 120 kilometers away, and the city of Madras or Chennai, 75 kilometers away, the distance between Kaveri-Pakkam and Kanchipuram must have seemed minimal. Place and date are intertwined, and the Kaveri-Pakkam materials have also been dated to both the 9th and 10th centuries. Several inscriptions found in Kaveri-Pakkam date to the second half of the 9th century, suggesting the presence of multiple temples there at that time. These temples must be the source of at least some of the sculptures and fragments we find in the museum and town today. But another inscription in Kaveri-Pakkam, which mentions a temple to a god called Kirti Martanda Kalapriya Deva, is dated to 963 CE in the 10th century. We know from other inscriptions that this temple was built through the patronage of the Rashtrakuta king Krishna III. Now, his kingdom was based to the west and northwest in what are today the states of Karnataka and Maharashtra, but he occupied northern Tamil Nadu during the 950s and 960s, and he had at least 3 temples built in this region. It's possible then that some of the Kaveri-Pakkam materials also date to this time. In fact, the scholars R. Nagaswamy and Charlotte Schmid have both proposed that the South Indian Yoginis belonged to this very temple of Kalapriya Deva, a fierce form of the god Shiva. They identify Krishna III's Kalapriya Deva with a sculpture of Shiva with 3 faces, the principal one in a fierce aspect, that was found in the early 20th century in a village called Tirumalai, close to Kaveri-Pakkam. By 2006, this sculpture was kept on the grounds of the Chennai Government Museum, but unfortunately, it hasn't been there during my own recent visits. Even relying on photographs, though, the similarities between this Shiva and the Yoginis are immediately apparent. Their facial features, size, stone type, and curved steely backdrops all speak to the possibility that they were once enshrined together in the same temple, or at least that they were carved by the same workshop of artists. I find the suggestion that this Shiva may be the Kalapriya Deva of Krishna III to be very interesting, but I'm not completely convinced of the full argument. I'm still not so sure we can rule out an earlier dating for the sculptures. And while Yogini goddesses are usually associated with fierce forms of Shiva, I question whether a temple enshrining both Shiva and multiple Yoginis would be called by Shiva's name alone. I'll return to this Shiva's relationship to the South Indian Yoginis in a moment, but first I want to think through a few more questions about the temple for which the Yogini sculptures were carved. No trace remains of this temple, but in thinking about what it may have looked like, we can turn to extant Yogini temples further north, in the present-day states of Odisha and Madhya Pradesh. All are roofless structures open to the sky, as I mentioned earlier, and all feature multiple shrines lining the periphery of their interior walls. These shrines were made to house yoginis, and in the temples at Hiropour, Ranipur Jarial, and Bharagat, most of the yogini sculptures remain today. Today, these temples are commonly referred to as Chaunsat Yogini, or 64 yoginis, regardless of the actual number of yoginis or yogini shrines they may contain. While 64 is the most common number for a group of yoginis, some temples only accommodate 42, and the temple at Bharagat has 81 peripheral shrines. So how many South Indian yoginis were there? Well, we know of at least 11 or 12 from the set, depending on whether known fragments were part of the same sculpture. And one fragment, by the way, is now missing and it's not pictured on this slide. If there were originally 64 yoginis in this temple, then a great many are unaccounted for. Charlotte Schmid has proposed that there were always only 12, but no other yogini temple enshrines so few goddesses. The variation in numbers for yogini groups in both temples and texts means that we're unlikely to be able to determine with complete certainty exactly how many yoginis were originally part of the South Indian group. However many South Indian yoginis there were, we can be fairly certain that they were enshrined around the inner periphery of a roofless temple facing the building's interior. This temple may have been circular in form, as most extant yogini temples are, or it could have been rectangular, like the one at Khajuraho. There may also have been an additional shrine at the center of the open interior space. Many, though not all, Yogani temples contain such a shrine. While some of these central shrines are empty today or have been altered, textual sources suggest that they are likely to have been built for a fierce form of Shiva, often called Bhairava. The central shrine in the Yogani temple at Ranipur Dharial still contains its original image, a Shiva with 3 faces, the central one in a fierce aspect. This image is not unlike the Shiva with which Nagaswamy and Schmid have associated the South Indian Yoginis, making the proposed association even more compelling. Now, if the multi-faced Shiva from Tamil Nadu did in fact share a temple with the Yoginis, then it seems that their temple may have contained more than one Shiva image. Recall that the Shiva on the left of this slide, now at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, was found together with several of the Yogini sculptures and is very likely to have been part of their temple. If both Shiva sculptures belonged to the temple, then perhaps the image with 3 faces, which is slightly larger, would have occupied a central shrine, and the Shiva now at the MFA would have occupied one of the peripheral shrines. Or perhaps only the MFA Shiva would have accompanied the Yoginis, whether in a central shrine or with them on the periphery of the temple. Other scenarios are possible too. So circular or rectangular, with or without a central shrine, what would the architecture of the temple have looked like? Its exterior walls were probably relatively plain, as the walls of most surviving Yogani temples are. Although some Yogani temples feature carved imagery and moldings that share a vocabulary with the architecture of more mainstream Hindu temples, a starker, more fort-like appearance is more common. The Yogani temple at Hiropour features austere architecture, but enshrines additional deities around its exterior and doorway, and on the exterior of its central shrine. Could the South Indian Yogani temple have incorporated additional deities in a similar way? This may be worth considering. While all surviving Yogani temples are made of stone, I wonder whether the one enshrining the South Indian Yoginis may have been built primarily of brick. We know from inscriptional references that brick was a common building material for temples in Tamil Nadu throughout the first millennium. Many of these temples were rebuilt in stone starting in the late 10th century, and some were upgraded to stone even earlier. Although many brick temples from the period of our Yoginis have either crumbled or have been converted into stone, some still survive in northern Tamil Nadu. 2 examples are the Sundaravarada Perumal and Kailasanatha temples at Uttiramerur, about 25 kilometers south of Kanchi, so also pretty close to Kaveripakkam. Both feature brick walls above granite foundations, and both date to the 9th century. The stucco that covers the walls makes the brick a little hard to discern in photographs, but you can see it where there is some damage to the wall. And I'm grateful to Emma Stein for sharing her photos with me, since I haven't had a chance to visit these temples yet. So if the South Indian Yogani temple was built of brick, this could help explain why we haven't found any trace of the building. Brick is far less durable than stone, and without the kind of upkeep like the temples at Uttiramerur have enjoyed, a brick structure is more likely to fall into ruin than a stone one, especially over the span of centuries. If the Yogani temple had stone foundations, perhaps we'll find them one day, though these could be buried deep in the ground, they could be reused in other structures, or they could be otherwise lost. The temple seems to have been abandoned a very long time ago indeed, for every sculpture from the set has endured damage, and most of the breaks are now well weathered, suggesting the damage has great age. Before any abandonment or damage, though, when the Yoginis, Shiva, and perhaps others were still enshrined in the temple that was built for them, who had this temple built and who used it? In part because Yoginis are believed to bestow great powers on their devotees, and also because of long-standing art historical assumptions about temple patronage in pre-modern India, Yogani temples are often assumed to have been royally sponsored. Maybe the patron of the Yogani temple in South India was the king Krishna III, as Nagaswamy and Schmid have proposed, or maybe it was a more locally based ruler in the late 9th or 10th century. Not all temple patrons in pre-modern India were royal, however, and it's also possible that the temple's patron or patrons belonged to a different elite social group. Whoever they were, They must have had access to significant resources in order to secure the land on which the temple stood, pay for the materials and labor necessary to construct the temple, pay artists for the numerous life-sized, expertly carved sculptures the temple enshrined, and sustain the temple's ritual life. Now, it would take much more time than we have today to fully consider the ritual life and community of the South Indian Yogani Temple, but I do want to address a few points around this subject. As Shaman Hatley has shown in his extensive scholarship on Yoginis, Yogani goddesses emerged from tantric traditions, but their temples were not strictly tantric in nature. They accommodated multiple modes of worship. While individuals who had been initiated into the tantric traditions of the Yoginis probably had a prominent role in the temple's ritual life, they may not have been the only participants. Hatley has written that the practices at Yogani temples seem to have included image worship, fire ritual, night vigils, and animal sacrifice, any of which could have involved non-initiated devotees. It's possible that the South Indian Yogani Temple also served as a site for more secretive, powerful practices that were restricted to tantric initiates. In both esoteric and exoteric contexts, however, the Yoginis' imagery, combining elements of the beautiful and the terrifying, would have encouraged practitioners to think beyond the assumptions of mainstream convention and perhaps to confront their own fears. Indeed, fear has been a common response to Yoginis, especially among people who do not understand them. Religious texts on the goddesses abound with warnings to anyone who might anger the Yoginis by sharing ritual knowledge inappropriately or by conducting rituals inaccurately. Such individuals will incur the curse of the Yoginis or even become food for the Yoginis. Vidya Deheja relates that during fieldwork for her 1986 book on Yogani temples, local people in many villages where such temples are found were reluctant to approach the structures or even to speak about them. By the 1980s, these temples had long ceased to be sites of active worship, at least on the scale for which they had been built, but to some people, they still retained a threatening power. The history of the South Indian Yoginis after the 900s and before 1926 is murky, and we do not know when their temple fell out of use. The temple's abandonment and eventual ruin, however, may have been tied to fears that people harbored toward the building and the goddesses it enshrined. Padma Kaimal notes that the damage seen in every sculpture from the set, with lopped off noses, arms, legs, and even heads, appears to have been deliberately executed. Whoever carried it out, Kaimal suggests that this vandalism was probably motivated by deep-seated anxieties around the potentially dangerous Yoginis. Damaging the sculptures that embodied these fierce goddesses would have neutralized their power. Just when the temple was abandoned and the sculptures damaged is an open question. It also isn't clear which of these events occurred first. Perhaps it was sometime in the 13th or 14th century, another time of political transition for northern Tamil Nadu, or perhaps it was slightly later. At some point, a few of the sculptures seem to have been re-enshrined, for the French archaeologist Juvo Dubreuil reported finding 7 female figures in or near a small modern shrine when he and Tangavelu located the sculptures in 1926. Writing to C.T. Liu, the art dealer in Paris to whom he sent the sculptures, Juvo Dubreuil added that Tangavelu had found additional sculptures, including a few more female figures and the Shiva, nearby next to a tank. Just how the two men acquired the sculptures, what kinds of negotiations they engaged in to remove them from their find spot, and with whom is not clear. All we know about this moment in the Yoginis' history comes from letters that Juvo Dubreuil sent to Liu. The details outlined in Juvo Dubreuil's letters can be inconsistent, and there are no photographs or drawings to show the exact context of the sculptures before Juvo Dubreuil and Tangavelu moved them. Perhaps additional materials will turn up in the C2 Liu archives that will help fill in some of these gaps in our knowledge. We do have photographs of the sculptures from this time, like this one, but they do not show the Yoginis in their find spot. Rather, they are believed to have been taken in the city of Pondicherry, quite possibly at Chevaux de Broy's home, where they seem to have spent some time before being shipped to Loo in Paris. Chevaux de Broy sent all but one of the Yoginis to Loo, whose gallery in the ensuing decades sold them to various museums and private collectors. The one remaining in India went to the government museum in Madras, the city now called Chennai. Very soon after the sculptures arrived at Loo's gallery, the Musée Guimet in Paris acquired 3 of the Yoginis, and the MFA in Boston acquired the Shiva. After that, it was nearly 30 years before Loo's gallery sold the last of the Yogani sculptures to the Minneapolis Institute of Art in 1960. The Detroit Institute of Arts purchased theirs in 1957. In the intervening years, however, various museums in the United States displayed Yogani sculptures in their galleries on loan from Loo. Documents in the DIA's archives show that in 1929, the DIA borrowed one that had previously been in Philadelphia. In 1933, Loo's office wrote to then DIA curator Benjamin March to request that this sculpture, identified as a mother goddess in the letters, be shipped to the William Rockhill Nelson Gallery in Kansas City, now the Nelson Atkins Museum. Recent research by Michelle Valentine at the Nelson Atkins Museum has confirmed that this is the very same Yogani that was accessioned into the Nelson Atkins collection 11 years later in 1944. C.T. Loo wasn't the only one who lent Yogani sculptures to public museums. The Yogani that is now at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Asian Art, the Freer Sackler, passed through the hands of 2 private collectors before landing in DC, both of whom were generous with loans. In fact, between about 1959 and 1966, this Yogani spent time at a place that will be very familiar to many of you, the Cincinnati Art Museum. During this time, she was part of the collection of Christian Humann, a famously private collector who preferred to remain anonymous. Some of you may have heard of the Pan-Asian collection. That was his. By 1968, though, this Yogani had been purchased by Arthur M. Sackler, who then lent the sculpture to the Brooklyn Museum of Art. It remained there until 1986, then went to DC in 1987, when the Arthur M. Sackler Gallery was established as part of the Smithsonian Institution. The South Indian Yoginis have certainly moved around then. In each place where they've rested, whether alone or together, they've fulfilled multiple purposes. Within their temple in northern Tamil Nadu, these powerful goddesses most likely supported multiple types of worship and practice for individuals with different levels of ritual knowledge. The fear they could inspire led someone to damage the sculptures at some point in time, presumably hoping to take their power away. Even so, after this, someone else seems to have still perceived their power to embody a divine presence and set some of the goddesses up in or near a shrine. When Chevaux de Broy and Tungavelu encountered the Yoginis, they saw them as sculptures, art objects that would garner the interest of museums and collectors. The sculptures certainly did, and for the most part, the Yoginis are primarily viewed as works of art today. Here are some views of some of the Yoginis in the museum galleries where they now live. Their place within museums immediately positions them as works of art, but in their presence, some viewers will still perceive their power. I certainly do. Different strategies of display and choices around the content of labels can encourage a different combination of approaches and responses: visual, spatial, intellectual, emotional. At the DIA, our South Indian Yogini is placed alongside sculptures representing the Hindu gods Shiva and Vishnu. She stands for Shakti, the supreme goddess. If visitors read her label, they'll learn that she once sat in a temple alongside numerous other such yoginis, each one combining threatening and alluring qualities, and that they embodied the power of Shakti together. In the museum, however, she does this work by herself. Similarly, in most other museums, each South Indian yogini stands alone, accompanied perhaps by other South Asian sculptures, but not by her companions. The one exception to this is at the Musée Guimet in Paris, where 3 yoginis sit together. And in 2013 to 14, Deborah Diamond brought 3 others together for her exhibition, Yoga, the Art of Transformation, as I mentioned at the outset of my talk. Standing before just one of these yoginis can already be a powerful experience. To be in the presence of 3 is all the more powerful. On an analytical level, presenting multiple yoginis together helps better approximate the spatial relationship they had to one another and to a visitor in the temple for which they were made. But the experience this kind of presentation creates goes beyond intellectual comprehension. It has the potential to create an emotional shift too for visitors who are open to that. Imagine then what the experience would be like to stand in the presence of all the known South Indian yoginis and their Shiva, or at least several of them. If they were arranged in a semicircle, they could completely occupy your field of vision, as they must have done in their temple. Bringing them all together would be no small feat, but I've been exploring this possibility together with other curators who steward these yoginis and related sculptures at other museums. We hope to make it a reality sometime in the not too distant future. As we think through how best to present these goddesses and their traditions in the museums where they live today, and potentially in the shared space of a special exhibition, perhaps it would be helpful to take a cue from the multiple types of practitioner and modes of practice that the yoginis are likely to have supported within their temple. Visitors with varying personal and educational backgrounds approach the yoginis with different preconceptions, different interests, and different hopes and desires for their visit. In the shared space of the museum gallery, we can endeavor to support in meaningful ways as many individual experiences as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. That was just astonishing.
Oh, thank you.
And, first question, is it clear in the Pandry sculpture that the name at the bottom of it is that of the deity rather than the donor?
That's a really great question. And it is because in the Bharagat temple, each of the Yogani sculptures has a different name inscribed into her pedestal, and some of them clearly relate to the iconography of the goddess. So for instance, there's a different goddess from the Bharagat temple that has sort of, you can see three faces. She probably was meant to be understood as having a fourth on the back of her head, but her name is Sarvatomukhi, or she who has faces looking in all directions. And so it seems pretty clear that these are indeed the names of the yoginis.
Okay. I had put up a question, was the damage natural or deliberate, which you then later answered, but I want to follow that up. When you said that people did it deliberately to take away their power. But, you know, in some cultures, if you damage something like that, there would be retribution against you. You know, bad things would happen to you. So they weren't worried about getting lightning striking them?
That's a really good question. And, you know, this is the idea that they were damaged in order for their power to be taken away is just one proposal, one possibility. We really don't know for sure why they were damaged, only that the patterns in the damage do look deliberate. So that seems to be the clearest explanation. But certainly it seems possible that that somebody might have been worried about that. I don't know, maybe the threat of the yoginis in all their power was even greater than the threat of any kind of consequences of damaging their sculptures. But that's a great question. That's something to think about more.
That's good. Okay, thank you. Are these Mulastana morthes, or are they from decorative pillars?
So the question, are these Mulastana morthes? That means were they enshrined in the main, sort of the main interior shrine of a temple, and they were, because remember, let me go back. If we look at the temples that still stand, you can see that there are many goddesses in their own little niches, their own shrines together in the temple. And this is different from like an image carved onto a pillar or carved decoratively onto exterior architecture. These were the goddesses, these were the deities that people worshipped when they went into the temples where they were enshrined.
And I'll just follow that up with, these seem to be freestanding buildings and not built into a cliffside.
Right.
Okay, So very different from the Chinese temples at Donghao and along the Silk Road.
Yeah, so there's a tradition of rock cut temples in India also, where people would carve directly into a mountain or a cliff, and they would sort of carve out an architectural space, and that would be the shrine. That's one tradition, but all known Yogani temples are structural temples, sort of built from the ground up.
Fascinating. Okay. Another question from Nagus. Mughals from around the 12th century onwards, and then the Dutch and British, are also known to have broken down Hindu temples. I guess she's saying, could it have been the Mughals, the Dutch, or the British?
Well, the Mughals didn't come to India until the 16th century, and they didn't come to South India till much later. There's actually not evidence for Mughals deliberately damaging temples. There's sort of a long-standing, not entirely true historiographical bias about Muslims destroying temples. And in some cases, in some very specific cases, temples that were associated with a ruler's power, maybe a Hindu king's power, would be damaged or even converted into a religious structure for a new king as an expression of a new king's power. That happened between Hindu rulers. It also happened between Muslim rulers and Hindu rulers. In the case of these yoginis, there weren't really any Muslim polities in this part of India. And so it doesn't seem likely to me that the yoginis, let me go back to the South Indian yoginis, that the yoginis would have been damaged by Muslims, but we really have no idea of the religious identity of whoever might have damaged these sculptures. It could have been other Hindus who were, more in line with those mainstream Orthodox traditions that didn't like the yoginis, tantric traditions. It's really impossible to say what the religious faith of the people that probably damaged these would have been.
You said there was some weathering though. So do we know, would it be 200 years ago, 400 years ago?
All we know is that it was hundreds of years ago.
Okay.
I don't know. I mean, maybe one day it will be possible to do some kind of test to determine how old the breakages are, but I'm not so sure about that. I think that the best we're going to be able to say is that it was a very, very long time ago, and that they were damaged for a very long time before they were found and brought to the indoor spaces where they live today.
Okay, fair. How popular are tantric beliefs today? Has any group of practitioners tried to reacquire any Yogini sculptures?
So there's this interesting sort of recent development where, well, there are different ways in which this happens. And so let me go back. At this Hiropour temple in Odisha, so this is close, for those of you who have some sense of the geography, this is very close to the town of Bhubaneswar in Odisha, formerly known as Orissa. And it's this fabulous temple in a small village called Hiropour. And you can see in the photograph on the right here, you can see some fabric in the left part and the garlands. So this temple is in active use. You can also notice that there are marigold flowers placed at the feet of all of the goddesses in this temple. So this is an instance where the temple is active, but it's not clear that it's been continuously active. And most likely the practices that are carried out today are not the same as the practices, or at least all the practices that would have been carried out when it was built in the 9th or 10th century. Some tantric rituals call for offering of blood or meat, and that might be like an animal sacrifice, for instance. And an animal sacrifice does take place at certain temples throughout India, but there are also more peaceful substitutes for some of these blood offerings that fierce goddesses like yoginis like. So for instance, you might offer red flowers instead of blood. And the marigolds here signal offerings to the goddesses and honoring the goddesses too in a more peaceful way. And it's possible, thinking about Shaman Hatley's work on yoginis and yogini temples, these temples, even when they were built, do seem to have accommodated different modes of worship, as I mentioned. So some people might have come here and engaged in more in practices that were a little closer to the mainstream practices, whereas others who were initiated might have engaged in sort of more dangerous tantric practices that could result in their gaining of powers. And there are there are people today who still practice tantric traditions in various tantric traditions, but it's not clear that anybody practices the same ones that would have been practiced in these temples.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, are we talking 0.5% of the population, or?
I really don't know. It's also very hard because, the tantras are supposed to be secret, right? And so there's a whole tradition. There's this tradition saying that you worship the god Vishnu in public and Shiva at home and the goddess personally. And that's sort of like these different degrees. I might be paraphrasing wrong, but it's this idea that the public face that you put out there is the most peaceful mainstream one, but you might engage in certain types of more personal practice that you don't necessarily express publicly, and that the tantric practices are tied to those more personal practices that one wouldn't necessarily advertise.
Okay, that's fair. Are you aware of any Hindu sculptures where Vishnu, Shiva, and other deities might be interacting, or are the sculptures all shown individually?
I'm not sure. Does the question mean interacting with each other, or so in the case of Yogani temples, the space creates sort of an interaction between the yoginis and the Shiva who's enshrined at the center, as well as the visitor to the temple with both the yoginis and the Shiva at the center. In terms of sculptures of different Hindu gods and goddesses interacting with one another, there's lots of stories about the gods and goddesses, and Hindu temples depict many of these stories. So in some cases, we see interactions between the gods related to those stories. One of them that comes to mind is a Shiva one about the god Shiva, and the idea is that Shiva became this infinite pillar of fire, this linga of fire, and the gods Brahma and Vishnu tried to find where his limit was. They tried to find Shiva's limit. So Brahma got on his swan and flew up to the sky, and Vishnu became a boar and dug down into the earth, but neither of them was able to find where Shiva ended, because the idea is that Shiva was infinite. He was greater than either of them. So in certain South Indian temples, there's this great image where you see Shiva as this endless pillar of fire, and you see these smaller images of the boar form of Vishnu and Brahma on his swan trying to find the end.
Well, and then we do have Shiva and Parvati.
Yep, Shiva and Parvati are believed to be, so Shiva, the god Shiva, and the goddess Parvati are husband and wife, and their sons are Ganesha, the elephant-headed god, and Skanda, Kartikeya.
Right, but Cincinnati Art Museum is a beautiful example of that. Just wonderful. Okay, next question. Justnagos was saying the Delhi Sultanate dates from the 1200s.
Yes, the Delhi Sultanate, which is, I don't know if that was in reference back to when we were talking about Muslim presence in India. That's different from the Mughals. So the Mughals are 16th century. The Delhi Sultanate starts in 1192. And before that, there are also Muslims in India, especially in the western part of India called Sindh, which is now part of Pakistan. Since the 8th century, there have been Muslims in India.
Traders, all those traders.
Yeah, traders.
Yeah. Okay, and then next question. Were there special days that people came together at these temples, men, women, and children?
Possibly. Research into how these temples were used in the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries is really still ongoing. But it's certainly possible to imagine that during certain times, people could have congregated in the open space in the middle for particular occasions. Again, multiple modes of practice could be supported.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I always like to imagine fire ceremonies in the middle of the night, you know. Mm-hmm. Be cool. Oh, here's your fan club from Ainsley. Thank you for your brilliant talk. I've been thinking a lot about matrikas lately and was struck by the Harley photograph and the collection of documents from C.T. Liu. The Yoginis, as they traveled around the U.S., were conflated with matrikas, and the photos seem to create a matrika set, positioning them in a line with Shiva to the left. Can you talk about the shifting identities between Shivas and between goddesses and Yogini sculptures?
Yeah, so actually, so the Sanskrit word matrika means mother, and Yoginis are very closely related to these this type of goddesses called matrikas. So when Juvo Dubreuil and Tungavelu found the Yoginis, and when Juvo Dubreuil wrote to C.T. Liu about them, they called them mothers. They thought that these were mother goddesses, and in fact, there are two. So there's a particular set of either 7 or 8 mother goddesses, matrikas, that are most of them are sort of female counterparts of well-known male gods. And so here in this photo, we see on the ends, on the left is the goddess Brahmani, and that's a sculpture now at the Asian Art Museum of San Francisco. And on the far right, we see Varahi, which is at the University of Michigan Museum of Art. And these two sculptures were found together with the Yoginis. And so it's quite possible that they would have been in this temple too. I just didn't focus on them today because you can see their scale is obviously different. I'm not convinced that they were carved at the same time as the Yoginis as part of the same set, but it's possible they wound up in the same temple for one reason or another. So that's kind of one point to make. But in many of the Yogani temples that still stand, you find the matrikas enshrined along with Yoginis. And in fact, texts about Yoginis sort of position Yoginis as being led by clans of matrikas. So there's a very, very strong connection between matrikas and Yoginis. And Shaman Hatley has an article about that too.
Okay. And whoop, I had one question and okay. Were there oral anecdotes from this region regarding fights between, I'm sorry, I hope I do this right, Shaivatis, Vaishnavites, and or Shaktitis?
Okay, so it's the question.
Sorry.
That's okay. So were there known to be disputes between Shaivites, Vaishnavites, and Shaktas? Yes. So those 3 words refer to sort of the 3 main sort of strains of Hindu practice, belief, allegiance, and the sort of the 3 main deities among the vast Hindu pantheon are the god Shiva, the god Vishnu, and the goddess Shakti. And so while most Hindus have a belief in all of the deities and believe that all the deities are worthy of worship, they will worship one particular god or goddess as more important than the others. And some worship Vishnu as the most important. Those people are Vaishnava or Vaishnavite. Some worship Shiva as most important. Those are Shaiva or Shaivite. And then the people who believe that the great goddess Shakti or Devi is the most important are Shakta. And in Tamil Nadu, let me go to one of the slides with the map. There have been, like, throughout centuries, there have been sort of histories recorded of disputes between people of these different, what we now think of as different Hindu sects, sort of arguing for the superiority of one over the other. There are also in Chola period inscriptions, like in the 12th century, there are also sort of disputes between Shaivas and Jains, another religion that was present in the area. And so, throughout time, we have these multiple religious systems being practiced, but disputes between them do also turn up. That's not to say that they destroyed each other's temples, but they engaged in some healthy arguments, and sometimes there seems to have been some violence involved too, but that wouldn't have been the majority of the time.
That's good to know. That's good to know. Okay. Anita is saying to everyone, Katherine, interesting and thought-provoking lecture. Your knowledge of the subject area and expertise are very apparent. And that's the last comment. And truthfully, it's a better summation than I had written out. So thank you. Thank you, Anita, very much for providing that one. I learned so much, and to me, it's fascinating to learn about the cultures of the world and how we all try to make sense of the world through religion, and how our lives are affected by them.